Gimel Tammuz is coming up. What's Gimel Tammuz? It's the day when we were no longer able to hear and see the Rebbe. I'm sure you observed that I didn't use a term that many people would have used, the day of his passing or any other similar expression. I deliberately avoided using that because for me and for multitudes of other Jews, the Rebbe is still here. And what we're going to talk about in the series of talks and conversations about the Rebbe is stories about the Rebbe before Gimel Tammuz, as well as stories about the Rebbe after Gimel Tammuz. And I have with me a very good friend, a therapist, a very noted therapist, Ruth Devora Wallen. Welcome, and I'm sure you have a lot to share about your relationship with the Rebbe before and after Gimel Tammuz.
Thank you very much for the honor of joining your show today.
The honor is mine, of course, but the day of Gimel Tammuz, just very briefly, is a day when we're experiencing a state of concealment, when we can't hear or see the Rebbe. But a Rebbe is not a simple, ordinary human being. Yes, he's human, but he's a human being who has tremendous spiritual energy, and that spiritual energy defines his existence, and that doesn't ever die. And thinking about what to talk about post Gimel Tammuz, how do we get guidance from the Rebbe now? We get guidance many different ways. The Rebbe, after the passing of his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, said that the Rebbe could respond to our questions. He could answer us. How? He'll find a way, go through the roof, go through a window. Of course, he was using those terms metaphorically, that the Rebbe will find ways to respond to us. And the Rebbe prepared us, it seems, for this period when we can't see or hear the Rebbe, that we can get messages from him. And Chassidim have different ways. Chassidim are very creative. One way they do it is by opening up one of the many volumes of the Rebbe's letters. The Rebbe authorized the publishing of his letters. So far, close to 50 volumes, Hebrew, Yiddish, English, have been published, and there's still a lot more that remains to be published. And what people do is they write whatever questions they have or recite them, say them, and they open up one of the volumes randomly. And believe it or not, they get incredible answers directly to their questions. That's one way that people feel, and it's based on different Jewish sources, that that's a legitimate thing to do. People feel that that's one way the Rebbe could respond. And it's interesting that before Gimel Tammuz, the Rebbe encouraged very strongly the publication of those letters. So it's clear that the Rebbe wanted us to consult in those letters. Sometimes we consult just by going to the index and looking for a topic. What does the Rebbe say about this matter, this illness, this spiritual matter? And we read those letters. But sometimes we just open up the volumes randomly. And some people go to the Ohel, the resting place. And many, many stories and miracles have happened. I'm going to share a story that I heard from my daughter's father-in-law. In Yiddish, we call that a mechutin, Rabbi Beryl Muchkin from Montreal, a very noted chassid. And I heard this story from someone else, totally unrelated. It was about a young, non-Hasidic Jew who had malignancy. And the doctor said he has to have surgery to remove it. But he, even though he wasn't a chassid, recognized the spiritual power of a tzaddik, of a righteous person. He went to the Rebbe, this is before Gimel Tammuz, and the Rebbe told him not to do the surgery. Well, when did he see the Rebbe? The Rebbe would distribute dollars every Sunday to every man, woman, and child, whoever came, with a blessing. And that was an opportunity for him to ask the Rebbe. And the Rebbe says, do not do the surgery. And he listened, to his credit. And many years passed, and he was doing fine. And then he contracted or developed another malignant tumor. And this time the doctors again advised him to do surgery, and he didn't know what to do because the Rebbe told him not to do surgery, but that was then. Now it might be a different problem. Maybe the Rebbe would agree to do the surgery. So he went to the Ohel, and he said his prayers and asked for the Rebbe's guidance. And then many people, when they go to the Ohel, after they come out, there's a small little building, and they play a video of the Rebbe. It's like a nonstop playing a video of many of the Rebbe's talks and his interactions with people when he would distribute dollars. And lo and behold, what does he see? He sees the Rebbe telling him not to do surgery. And again, to his credit, he didn't do the surgery. I heard the story from two different sources. So here's a story of before Gimel Tammuz and after Gimel Tammuz.
Connecting both stories.
Connecting them together.
So you mentioned Montreal, and it reminds me of a post-Gimel Tammuz story that happened directly to me. That right after Gimel Tammuz, there was a Rebbitzin in Montreal, the principal of a high school, and she called me up and she said she would like me to come 2 weeks from then for Shabbos to do a Shabbaton. At that point, I wasn't running around. I was in Kollel with my husband at that time, and I wasn't traveling, and I said, I'm not sure if I should go. She goes, but the Rebbe already gave you a bracha. I said, how is it that I have a bracha? You haven't asked me yet. She goes, well, because it was right after Gimel Tammuz, we wrote a letter to the Rebbe from the Hanhala, the administration of the school, asking the Rebbe if we should have a serious event with one of the rabbis in town, or if it should be a Lebediker Farbrengen. And the Rebbe said a Lebediker Farbrengen. And she had mentioned my name and the rabbi's name in this letter. So she said, the Rebbe said, es soll sein a Lebediker Farbrengen. It should be a lively gathering. And she said, you've got a bracha from the Rebbe. You have to do it. And so I made arrangements, and I ended up going there. And it was a very successful thing. And I think at that time, people were very distraught and confused, and they didn't know if they're allowed to rejoice. What are we supposed to do? And that was a seemingly very clear answer at the time. So I've had some post-Gimel Tammuz things myself. I've seen a lot of them with my practice, people asking questions in these books you're talking about, the Igros Kodesh, the holy letters. Right. And it's a fascinating phenomenon.
Talking a little bit more about Gimel Tammuz, Gimel Tammuz has two other historical events that occurred then that have a direct relationship to the Gimel Tammuz of this generation. The first one is a biblical event. When Joshua was conquering the land of Canaan, there was a battle, and it was getting close to sunset, and it would be hard to continue the battle, and he stopped the sun. The sun stopped in its tracks. In other words, he delayed sunset. There were different opinions for how many hours it happened, but this was one of the miracles. And many Hasidim took this to mean that the sun did not set, that even though we couldn't see or hear the Rebbe physically, we couldn't relate to him, but
we're delaying the sunset.
Did not set. Then there's another event that happened much more close to our times, in the previous Rebbe, who was arrested by the communist regime in 1927 and was originally sentenced to death, and they commuted the sentence to 10 years in slave labor. Then they commuted that to 3 years in exile in a city called Kostroma. So when they released him from prison to go to Kostroma, it was Gimel Tammuz, the third of Tammuz. And the Rebbe referred to that as the beginning of the redemption. The redemption, he was liberated entirely a little over a week later on the 12th and 13th of Tammuz. They told him about his liberation on the 12th, and he was finally liberated on the 13th. But when did it all begin? When did the liberation begin? On the 3rd of Tammuz. So many Hasidim interpret this to mean that the fact that the Rebbe's disappearance, as it were, occurred in Gimel Tammuz means that planted in that event is the mechanism, the dynamic for redemption.
We see this throughout history, right? There are always the seeds of the redemption in seemingly, confounding experiences for the Jewish people. The concealments seem inappropriate, but then all of a sudden you see things changing.